The Krapina site in northern Croatia has long been treated as one of the canonical Neanderthal sites, a textbook assemblage used to define what Neanderthals were supposed to look like. Yet this confidence rests less on an absence of ambiguity than on a tradition of classification that hardened over the 20th century, often retroactively imposing rigid species boundaries onto a period that was anything but rigid. The argument that Krapina could represent a hybrid human population only makes sense if we stop imagining Ice Age Europe as sealed off and instead see the Eastern Mediterranean as a lively human genetic mixing zone during the last Interglacial, where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were swapping genes, culture and caves. When Krapina is reinserted into its full geographic, climatic and temporal context, specifically the last Interglacial, when sea levels were high, climates were warm and human populations were expanding and mixing genes across the Eastern Mediterranean, the site begins to look less like a closed Neanderthal enclave and more like a plausible hybrid zone. The argument is not that Krapina individuals were secretly modern humans, in a simplistic sense, but that they may represent a population shaped by repeated contact between Neanderthal-leaning groups in Europe and Homo sapiens-leaning populations circulating through the Levant, Anatolia and southern Europe. The key to this argument lies in abandoning the idea of Europe, Asia and Africa as biologically bounded continents during the Middle to Late Pleistocene. During interglacial periods, especially marine isotope stage 5, the Eastern Mediterranean functioned as a continuous ecological corridor. The Balkans, Italy, Greece, Anatolia, the Levant and North Africa were not marginal peripheries, but central arteries of movement. Coastlines were productive, climates were forgiving, and there were no meaningful natural barriers preventing populations from drifting, expanding and overlapping. In such a world, the expectation should not be isolated pure populations, but mosaics, groups carrying mixtures of traits shaped by both deep local ancestry and more recent gene flow. Krapina sits squarely within this corridor. Geographically, it occupies a position between the Italian peninsula, the Balkans, and the broader Danubian route into Central Europe. Temporally, it is usually placed around 120,000 years ago, firmly within the last Interglacial. This timing matters enormously. It places Krapina not after Neanderthals had supposedly crystallized into a fully isolated European lineage, but during precisely the period when Homo sapiens were already present in the Eastern Mediterranean. Sites such as Skull Cave and Kafse Cave demonstrate that anatomically modern humans were established in the Levant by roughly the same time, while Tabun Cave preserves a record of Neanderthal-associated populations occupying the same landscape. The Levant was not a boundary between species. It was a contact zone where populations overlapped, replaced one another, and almost certainly interbred. Once this Levantine picture is accepted, it becomes increasingly difficult to argue that such mixing stopped abruptly at the Aegean or Adriatic. Greece, southern Italy and the Balkans are not distant from Mount Carmel. They are part of the same Eastern Mediterranean system. The presence of early Homo sapiens in Greece, dramatically underscored by the Apidima fossils, reinforces this point. Apidima Cave has yielded remains that strongly suggest Homo sapiens were present in southern Europe far earlier than traditionally assumed, potentially 120,000 years ago or even earlier. Whether one accepts every detail of the Apidima interpretation or not, its existence alone shatters the notion that Europe was a Neanderthal-only zone during the last Interglacial. Italy tells a similar story. The Sacopastor skulls, often classified as Neanderthals, display a mix of traits that have long unsettled tidy taxonomies. They are robust and archaic in some respects, yet they also show features that blur the line between Neanderthals and early modern humans. When placed alongside Skull, Kafse, Tabun and Apidima, Sacopastore looks less like a regional oddity and more like another node in a broad zone of morphological and genetic blending stretching from North Africa through the Levant and into southern Europe. Krapina fits naturally into this pattern. The assemblage itself is famously large and diverse, comprising remains from many individuals of different ages. Such a large sample should not be expected to present a single uniform morphology, and indeed it does not. Instead, Krapina exhibits pronounced mosaicism. Some cranial features align strongly with classic Neanderthal traits, robust brow ridges, thick cranial bones and certain aspects of facial morphology, while other traits are more generalized, primitive, or even reminiscent of early modern humans. Juvenile specimens in particular have historically fueled debate because their cranial shapes can appear unexpectedly modern depending on which features are emphasized. Mosaic anatomy, however, is precisely what one would predict in a hybrid or contact zone population. Hybridization does not produce neat averages, it produces variability. Some individuals lean more heavily toward one ancestral population, others toward another, and many fall somewhere in between. Over time, certain traits may become stabilized through selection or drift, while others remain fluid. In this light, the variability at Krapina ceases to be a problem to explain away, and instead becomes part of the evidence. The interglacial context strengthens this interpretation. This was not a period of isolation and retreat, but of expansion, experimentation and movement. Warmer climates opened northern and upland regions, coastlines became rich ecological zones, and population densities likely increased. Increased population density almost inevitably leads to increased contact between groups. In such circumstances, strict reproductive isolation is biologically implausible. Even small amounts of gene flow, repeated over thousands of years, would be enough to leave morphological signals without necessarily erasing local adaptations. The Eastern Mediterranean mixing zone was also culturally and technologically dynamic. Tool traditions did not respect modern continental boundaries, and similar lithic strategies appear across wide regions. While stone tools alone cannot diagnose species, they do indicate shared knowledge networks and repeated interaction. The Krapina occupants were not living at the edge of the world. They were embedded within a web of human movement and communication that extended south and east as well as north and west. Critically, the traditional argument against a hybrid interpretation often relies on a circular logic. Krapina is defined as Neanderthal because it is in Europe and roughly the right age, and then its traits are interpreted through that lens. But once sites like Epidema demonstrate that Homo sapiens were already present in Europe during the same broad time window, that logic collapses. Europe was not a closed Neanderthal continent awaiting invasion. It was already part of a shared Afro-Eurasian human landscape. The Levantine sequence is especially instructive here. At School and Kafse, Homo sapiens appear with robust bodies, large faces, and some archaic traits, while at Tabun, Neanderthal-associated populations occupy the same region at overlapping or near-overlapping times. If one accepts that School Kafse humans were anatomically modern despite their robusticity, and that Tabun individuals were Neanderthal despite their variability, then one must also accept that the boundary between these groups was porous. Once porosity is acknowledged in the Levant, extending it into southern and southeastern Europe is not a radical leap, but a parsimonious inference. In fact, the discoverer of the Krapina site in 1899 wrote that Neanderthals evidently did not coexist peacefully with their neighbours, because our diluvial man was apparently a cannibal, judging by the fragments of charred skull and extremities. It is difficult to imagine that early man from Krapina enjoying the wealth of his hunt in peace and undisturbed. No doubt he was attacked on his territory from time to time by neighbouring hordes who may not have had such abundant hunting grounds. Neanderthals fell on each side, and the victors proceeded with the dead, as they did with the catch from a good hunt. Hybridization does not require constant, massive gene flow. Even episodic contact, small groups moving along coasts, river valleys, or inland corridors, would suffice. The Balkans, in particular, function as a natural crossroads linking the Near East with Central Europe. The location of Krapina within this crossroads makes it an excellent candidate for a population shaped by repeated pulses of contact rather than long-term isolation. Another point often overlooked is that Neanderthals themselves already carry genetic signals of earlier Homo sapiens introgression, long predating the famous late Neanderthal-modern human admixture events around 50,000 years ago. This alone undermines the idea of Neanderthals as a long isolated lineage. If earlier gene flow occurred somewhere in the broader Near Eastern or Mediterranean region, then populations like those at Krapina could represent descendants of that earlier mixing, expressing it in morphology rather than in directly recoverable DNA. The absence of ancient DNA from Krapina is frequently cited as a limitation, but it cuts both ways. Without DNA, morphology must be interpreted probabilistically, not dogmatically. When morphology shows mosaic patterns, when geography places a site in a known mixing corridor, and when chronology aligns with an interglacial expansion phase, a hybrid interpretation becomes not speculative fantasy, but a reasonable working hypothesis. Two further lines of evidence reinforce the plausibility of Krapina as a hybrid or contact zone population rather than a culturally and biologically sealed Neanderthal enclave: the controversial defleshing of skulls and the presence of eagle talons that many researchers interpret as symbolic objects. Both phenomena matter because symbolism is not simply a behavioral curiosity, it is a proxy for social cognition, identity marking, and shared meaning, precisely the domains most likely to diffuse across populations in sustained contact. At Krapina, the pattern of cut marks on cranial bones has long been debated. While some have framed the evidence in terms of cannibalism or mortuary processing, an alternative interpretation is that skull defleshing reflects ritualized treatment of the dead, possibly involving secondary burial, ancestor veneration, or the display and manipulation of heads. Such practices are not unique to any one hominin group and appear repeatedly in contexts where populations are socially complex and symbolically engaged. In a hybrid framework, skull defleshing at Krapina can be understood not as an isolated Neanderthal oddity, but as part of a broader Eastern Mediterranean tradition of symbolic mortuary behavior, one that may have been shared, borrowed, or co-developed among interacting Homo sapiens and Neanderthal populations during the Interglacial. The eagle talons from Krapina sharpen this argument further. These talons show wear patterns and modifications consistent with suspension or handling, strongly suggesting their use as personal ornaments rather than as food remains. Eagle talons are not utilitarian tools. They carry symbolic weight, likely signaling status, identity, or group affiliation. Crucially, such symbolism appears at Krapina far earlier than the conventional narrative allows for widespread symbolic behavior in Europe. In a strict isolation model, this symbolism must either emerge independently among Neanderthals or be explained away as anomalous. In a hybrid or mixing zone model, however, the talons make far more sense. Symbolic practices are precisely the kinds of behaviors that spread through contact, intermarriage, and shared social spaces. The Eastern Mediterranean during the last interglacial, linking North Africa, the Levant, Greece, Italy, and the Balkans, was a region where symbolic repertoires could circulate alongside genes. Eagle talons at Krapina, like shell beads at school and kafze or ochre used across the Levant and North Africa, fit comfortably into a picture of shared symbolic language across populations that modern taxonomy later tried to separate. In this light, Krapina symbolism does not merely humanize its occupants. It places them squarely within a connected, culturally fluid world where biological and cultural boundaries were equally permeable. Seen this way, Krapina no longer stands alone. It joins Apidima in Greece, Sacco Pastore in Italy, and the School Kafse Tabun complex in the Levant as part of a broad Eastern Mediterranean continuum of human populations during the Interglacial. Some of these populations lean more toward what we later label Neanderthal, others toward modern human, but all occupy a shared evolutionary space in which boundaries were fluid and identities were not fixed. The deeper implication is that our taxonomic categories may be obscuring more than they reveal. Labels such as Neanderthal and Homo sapiens are useful shorthand, but they risk imposing 20th century clarity on Pleistocene reality. During the last interglacial, humans were not sorted neatly into boxes. They were experimenting, adapting, and interbreeding across a landscape that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe into a single biological system. Krapina in this framework becomes something far more interesting than a mere Neanderthal type site. It becomes a snapshot of that system in action, a population living at a crossroads during a warm, expansive phase of human history, carrying with them a mixture of traits shaped by both local European ancestry and broader Eastern Mediterranean gene flow. Whether one ultimately labels them hybrids, early Neanderthals with sapiens admixture, or archaic Homo sapiens, the core point remains the same. The site makes far more sense as part of a connected, mixed human world than as an isolated, evolutionary cul-de-sac. If the Eastern Mediterranean during the Interglacial had no hard boundaries, then neither did its people. And if that is true, then variability is not an anomaly to be explained away, but a signal, one that points toward a deep, complex history of movement and mixing at the very heart of Ice Age Europe. Thanks for watching.